All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole Owens, and this is another Mass Medic webinar. Today, we are talking about what you should know about MDR best practices, including Pmcf. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications at Mass Medic. If you're not familiar with us, we are a trade association for medical device companies in the New England area, and we work to bolster the ecosystem through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Big thank you to our friends at Alira Health for sponsoring the conversation today. Just want to make you aware of a few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you'd like. And we're also recording this webinar, so everyone who registered will get a copy after the webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Ainoa Forteza. She's the Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs at Alira Health. Ainoa.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you all for joining today to this panel. As introduced by Nicole, we are going to discuss today with top industry experts how the MDR has impacted their products portfolio and which best practices they can share to overcome these MDR requirements to all of you attending. Again, as Nicole has said, we encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom, and please do not wait until the end to ask the questions. We will be taking questions at the end of the discussion about the topics that are going to be covered during the presentation, but we will not be taking specific questions about the companies where our panelists are coming from. So before letting our panelists to present themselves, I need to say that unfortunately, Sharon Timberlake, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Quality at Gentuity, is not going to be able to join us today due to a last-minute personal issue. We wish her all the best. That means that we are going to plan a second edition of this webinar to cover the topics that Sharon was going to present. And also, if there's any additional topic that you may want to see in that second edition, please make sure to tell us in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I would like for the two panelists to present themselves. Anaga, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Ainoa. Hi, everybody. My name is Anaga Karnik. I currently serve as the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Edwards Life Sciences in their mitral and tricuspid division. I support the leaflet repair technology for CE marking and rest of world.
Thank you, Anaga. Arthi?
Sure, thank you, Ainoa, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those on this call. My name is Arthi Chandran. I lead the health economics and reimbursement capability for Abbott Medical Devices. I also have a public health and regulatory affairs background as well. And so today I'll be representing myself, my views, and my collective experience working cross-functionally with my regulatory affairs partners in driving access by leveraging MDR.
Thanks a lot, Arthi. So before starting the discussion itself, I will share my screen because I would like to introduce first some background on which have been the main changes introduced by the MDR and some ideas about the transition dates as well. Okay. Okay. So the MDR is coming from the previous Medical Devices Directive, and it was published as an attempt to increase the safety around medical devices and to try to harmonize the European approach to these products. The MDR was published indeed in 2017, but it has become fully applicable on May last year. Although it is true that the original application date was in 2020, but it was postponed 1 year due to the COVID pandemic. So let's say that from now on, since May last year, all companies that are developing products that have never been on the market, the only legislative text applicable is the MDR, the Medical Devices Regulation. It is true that there are some exemptions, let's say, for fully applying the MDR. We'll see that. For products that are currently self-certified under the Medical Devices Directive, but that are a higher risk class under the MDR, the sponsor has until 2024 to comply with the MDR, provided that there is no significant change introducing the product. Furthermore, for products with existing certificates under the MDD, those certificates will be valid until the expiry date. But please keep in mind that there are anyway some measures that should be implemented since the MDR was fully applicable last year. And we will see that. One of these measures is the post-market surveillance requirements or the post-market clinical follow-up requirement. With this slide, we are providing you an overview of the main changes introduced by the MDR. And just as a note, the MDR contains 290 times the word safety, whereas in the MDD, it only appeared 40 times. So you can see what we were mentioning at the beginning about the intention of the European Commission to increase the safety of the products that are going to be placed on the European market. So as main changes introduced by the MDR, we can say that, for example, the MDR is contemplating now new types of products that were not previously under the scope of the MDR, of the MDD, or that was not even mentioned. And accordingly, there are new classification rules for these new products, but for other existing products as well. Furthermore, the clinical evidence that needs to be provided under the MDR, we can say that it's more strict and more related not only to the demonstration of safety itself, but to the clinical meaningfulness of the clinical data that we are providing and of the products. There are, as an example, new requirements about UDI. This is more related to what was already existing in the US, the unique device identifier. Differences or stricter requirements, let's say, as well, in terms of the responsibilities allocated to the economic operators, like the authorized representative, or the need to identify the person responsible of regulatory compliance. Another big change we can say as well is the implementation of the UDAMED database, not 100% fully functional yet, but on the way. And another change, which was quite surprising as well, is the inclusion of products without a medical purpose, but with an aesthetic one under the scope of the MDR as well. This is just an overview for us to be on the same page, understand where is this coming from, how the MDR was published, and why there's so much struggle, let's say, with implementing the MDR, because there are indeed a lot of new requirements to implement and a lot of new topics to cover. And just to finalize, I wanted to provide you as well with these figures. These are recent figures published by MedTech Europe about the situation of the MDR implementation in Europe. But it's just for you to have an idea about the current situation. So, for example, the MDR certificates have not been issued yet for more than 85% of the 500,000 devices that were previously certified under the MDD or AMDD. There's still 70% on revision of the submitted applications ongoing. And there's a list between 15 and up to 30% of the small, medium-sized enterprises that are still having no access to an MDR designated notified body. So these are just some numbers recently published. You can see here others. You will have this information as well, but it was just to give you an overview of the dramatic situation that's going on, and precisely what we want to achieve with this webinar, with this discussion with the top industry experts. It's precisely to give you best practices, because they have been on the same situation. They've been facing the implementation of the MDR as well, and we want to have that view for you if you are on similar situation. So I will stop sharing right now. Okay. And let me check. Okay, I think that I've stopped sharing. And I will like to open the floor to the discussion right now with Anaga and Arthi. So having seen all these dramatic numbers, all the different requirements to be implemented, like all the changes, I am sure that at the moment the MDR was published, you had an initial perception of a requirement or a topic introduced by the MDR that you thought maybe was more difficult for you to implement at that time. But was there really any difference between this initial thinking when the MDR was published, you read it and you thought, oh, those are a lot of requirements, and the thoughts later at the reality of the day-to-day implementation to your devices?
I can go first. Great question. I know you are spot on that the initial perception several years ago was that, yes, there is a new set of regulations out there that are, as you said, much longer than the MDD. And there are a lot more stringent requirements. The ERC is being replaced with the GSPR checklist and things like that. But where we are today, we're viewing MDR as a new way of certification and really a life cycle management approach to medical device regulations that has truly elevated the responsibilities of the medical device manufacturers. What that means is it's beyond just a regulatory submission and getting a device to market. It is truly making sure that companies are prepared for what's to come for years ahead. There's also, I think, between the initial perception and maybe where we are today, the understanding of a lot more transparency in the information that is available externally. So the UDI mandate that you brought up is a great example. Another example would be the HCP and patient SSEP that now needs to be made publicly available. So in a nutshell, I think between the initial perception and now, what is important for medical device manufacturers to know is planning a lot more time and a lot more resources for MDR compliance, and particularly for the initial conformity assessment of their devices.
That was so well stated, Anaga. I think the outcomes that you highlighted are certainly the positive benefits that came from this regulatory change. And I would say that, I know to your question, the health economics team wasn't necessarily formally brought into this process at the very beginning, but given the magnitude of this change and the fact that it was the first change to come after decades in the EU, obviously the entire industry community was very interested in understanding more about what we were trying to do and what it would take to get us there. And I think that in that interest and curiosity came opportunity. And so it was clear from the dialogue during that period of time where everybody was trying to seek to understand that the magnitude of the change was significant from a systems and process perspective, but also it created an opportunity. It created an opportunity for us to systematically clean house, if you will. and go through our portfolios and understand the level of fact base we had to support our technology versus the requirements. And it also allowed us to interrogate where there may be opportunities to tack on additional requirements for our marketing teams, for our medical affairs teams, and for our payer access teams when we had to invest. And I think that, you know, going through the exercise of just systematically revisiting the portfolio and understanding what additional evidence was needed to satisfy our MDR requirements, and whether the pathway to that evidence generation led to further opportunities, that started a dialogue that was cross-functional in nature. And it really turned a requirement into a true opportunity to differentiate ourselves through the investments that we would be making. And so I think that's where we landed. And although depending on the types of portfolios you're supporting, the incremental evidentiary requirements were not always very large. In the instances that there were absolutely opportunities to collaborate and optimize those investments.
Thanks a lot, both. This is an interesting view. And maybe, Anaga, I want to ask you something about, you were saying, okay, you need a lot of more time and resources for planification. Precisely one of the challenges introduced by the MDR, it's not only about manufacturers, but notified bodies as well, right? And we are currently under a situation where there's a huge bottleneck. And this is something that has reminded me of when you were saying, you know, you need to plan a lot more time, but it's not only the time to implement MDR, but currently it's about the time for the notified bodies to review that information, right? Well, it was just curious because there's like two sources, let's say, of extra time that you need to allocate currently, right? And Anaga, which tips, which best practices do you think you can give the audience to overcome these MDR challenges?
Yeah, sure. I know. Happy to share some best practices, some very practical tips from a regulatory perspective that I'd like to offer the audience. Number one, and you brought up notified bodies, so we have to keep in mind that this is new to all of us, notified bodies included. And one thing that is certainly appreciated by the notified body as well is they're not trying to be difficult by any means, right? It's a lot on them as well, as we can all imagine. And partnering with them early is really critical, not just from the point of view that they know what is coming their way for review, but also to set the right expectations cross-functionally. Aarti brought up a great point about how this is a cross-functional team effort, and partnering with the notified body early helps us have more of a voice in influencing our cross-functional team members as to what they can expect during a review cycle, and how some of these expectations that again differ from notified body to notified body. And why this early partnership is important is because even from a very practical standpoint, your notified body might have some specific forms that they want you to complete, some templates, or a certain format in which they want information presented. And it's important to have that clarity up front so that there isn't duplication of efforts at a later time, or the team is not scrambling when the actual submissions are being put together. So again, just sharing from a regulatory perspective, that is very important to understand upfront what those expectations are. The second one, which might sound oversimplistic, but classification of your device. And not just the device itself, but the accessories as well. And why that's important to do upfront is we don't want a certain accessory, for instance, to be held to the same rigor of compliance that we would, let's say, a class 3 device. So that is also important to present with full transparency to the notified body as to what components comprise the entire device and what we as a manufacturer plan for MDR compliance of each of those components. So that would be another best practice, I think, for all of us to follow. And then a few other things I can think of are the performance standards that our device claim compliance to. Now, this is not necessarily new. Even under the MDD, we were, of course, required to share a list of standards that our device is tested to, what we're claiming compliance to. What is a little bit different under the MDR, as we understand now, is not only do we want to highlight what standards we're claiming compliance to, but we want to be able to identify whether we're claiming compliance in full or in part. And if it is partial, then what the justification is for why certain sections are not applicable. So in other words, I think we can expect a lot more scrutiny on the performance standards aspect as compared with what we did in the MDD days. And it's important for manufacturers, so particularly cross-functional team members for R&D, to partner with their regulatory team members to make sure those gap assessments are in place if applicable. A couple other things I can think of, and these are more holistic in nature, is treating MDR as a blank slate. Now, the question that comes up then is, does this mean we can't use our prior testing or validations? And not necessarily. However, we should be expecting that these will be re-challenged. So in other words, older documentation can certainly be used. However, it needs to be reviewed thoroughly to make sure that it meets the MDR requirements. So an example I can think of is design specs, for instance. What we can't do, or I should say we shouldn't be doing, is leveraging a specification from a device that is MDD approved. We want to go back to the clinical or the functional origin of that specification. So in other words, it's not that the spec has to change in any way, but we have to really go back to the origin. And that's where I keep going back to the blank slate. So treating it as a brand new way of certification is critical. And then another example I can think of is equivalence. So again, because there is not an MDR device yet that we can claim equivalence to, it's important to present the data in a way that the notified body has access to be able to re-review it and then approve it on the basis of what information is available for the device at hand, as opposed to claiming equivalence because that would be to a device approved under the MDD. So those are, yeah, I feel like those are some practical tips I feel are important to share.
Thanks a lot, Tanaka. It's interesting because I think that when you were talking about using existing information, right? I think this is directly linked as well with the post-market requirements, right? Because, I mean, the potential use of that post-market data for products that were in the market under the MDD, potentially, to leverage that information as input data for the MDR is something that it is valuable, right? But it is true that the MDD requirements were lacking or were a little much more weak, right, in terms of post-market surveillance data. Precisely, this is one of the main and big issues or big topics under the MDR, right? The need to implement this post-market surveillance system, but also the elaboration of the post-market clinical follow-up. You know, this is something that it is causing a lot of struggle in companies nowadays. So maybe I would like to ask you, which guidance would you provide to companies that, for example, need to implement a PMCF, a post-market clinical follow-up?
Right, yeah. I would say, I know, and you do bring up a good point, because I think the expectations from a post-market standpoint are certainly very different today than they were under the MDD. And that's where I'm coming from with the life cycle approach, because it's more than just a regulatory submission. It's more than a one-time approach to get the device to market. Each notified body is different. However, there is an expectation when an application is initiated. So really that's when you embark on this journey of either transitioning to MDR or initial approval under MDR. The expectation is that we as the manufacturer should be putting together a PMCF plan, which shows the notified body what the methods and the procedures are to proactively collect and evaluate clinical data. Similarly, for a PMS plan, and the notified body can then, or has the opportunity to review it and challenge some of the aspects in there. So in the PMCF plan, things like the length of follow-up. There may be certain future considerations of what kind of reports we're required to send to the notified body. Or from a PMS standpoint, making sure that the plan covers how we as the manufacturer will cover specifics for the device at hand, in addition to what is included in our quality management system as a whole from a procedure standpoint. And this is where I think it is helpful to perhaps treat it as a two-phase approach, or happening in parallel, but still in two phases, where we bring up our quality management system to the MDR standards, while also working on the technical information for the device. And to your question about PMCF or PMS, there will be certain procedures that will need to be brought up to the MDR compliance standards, but there will also be device-specific documents that need to be created. And the expectation should be that these are provided to the notified body upfront, so they have an opportunity to challenge some of the sections in there, and there is an opportunity to have some of the back and forth before any of those are locked.
Thanks, Anaga. I don't know, Arthi, if you want to provide your view as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I can offer that the specificity provided around, you know, post-market surveillance or clinical follow-up has changed the way we look at real-world evidence, and certainly has elevated the maturity of our capabilities around managing this type of data and leveraging this type of data, not only to meet the regulatory requirements, but again, thinking more broadly about the use case for the investment that we have to make in this space. I think this is where in the next 5-10 years, where I feel that we're going to start to see companies differentiate from each other in, you know, how they leverage this data to help patients gain access to their technologies, but also learn more about the marketplace and also inform future innovation. So historically, medical device companies have had limited utility for real world evidence and secondary data analysis in general, because much of the data really required to gain regulatory approval and ultimately deliver against our commercialization objectives was really addressed with the core clinical programs. But you know, since that time, evidence demands of our payers have really reached beyond levels of pharma and certainly have bled into medtech at a rapid pace. And over the past decade, I'd say we've seen an increasing need to deliver evidence-based value dialogue to really be able to gain access in key markets. And so to that end, you know, when we think about the commitments we're making, whether that's, you know, our post-market surveillance strategy, if we have to set up registries, if we have to, have a clinical follow-up plan, thinking critically about finding, ways to integrate additional endpoints, whether that's quality of life, whether that's healthcare utility,
Good point.
whether that is health resource utilization in local markets. Those types of things now allow us to have a much stronger and detailed dialogue about the performance of our products in the real world, not only around safety, but the utility of our technologies in the care pathway. Strengthening our position in the marketplace, but also, really helping us rationalize the need for adoption of these technologies. And really that's what this part of the requirement has afforded us, is the opportunity to seek that type of resource.
Thank you both. I mean, this is a very interesting view because it is true that maybe until now we've been focusing more maybe on the regulatory perspective, but I think that this view from the market access is interesting as well to understand how the MDR has impacted as well, right? The market access activities. I don't know, Arthi, if you may want to share with the audience as well some best practices that you can share from the market access perspective.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I know that EU MDR and our post-marketing clinical follow-up, it can be overwhelming. There's a lot of components to it. And you absolutely, as Annika had mentioned earlier, have to be resourced just to deliver against the regulatory requirements. But I keep using the word opportunity because I think that really is what it is. There is a silver lining to the changes that many of us have had to make. And I think everybody should take that silver lining mindset. The requirements of the regulations, they essentially open a window for continuous data generation. That's kind of how I look at it. And how we choose to leverage that data beyond the intended use of, demonstration of safety and meeting the requirements is where we will start to differentiate. So from an access perspective, I would say that post-marketing commitment really allows us to benchmark our data. It allows us to benchmark our data against competitors. It allows us to study the real world performance of our technologies. As I just mentioned, you can look at clinical utility, you can look at quality of life, you can look at patient experience differently, ultimately strengthening the value argument for your technologies to service a completely different set of stakeholders. So when we think about what our remit is in industry, it's to deliver innovation that drives, patient wellness safely, right? And patients are not going to be able to experience the value of our technologies unless we, do what we can to ensure that we find a pathway for access to those technologies for our patients, navigating the policies of different marketplaces. And that requires us to pay attention to the needs of a variety of different stakeholders. So our regulatory stakeholders, our clinical stakeholders, and our healthcare decision makers or our payers. By holding all of these stakeholder needs at equal footing, we really have visibility to all of the data requirements to be able to navigate that pathway for our patients. And so if we can augment our value stories with health resource utilization data, with comparative data that comes out of the way we design the solutions for our post-market requirements, then at the end of the day, we will be able to answer what our payers really want to understand, which is, do our technologies perform as they did in our clinical trials in the real world? And are we able to deliver against that promise in the marketplace? And so I think that that's what we need to keep in mind. is have a view of not only what our internal needs are, but make sure that that stems from the external requirements of our universe of stakeholders between our product and our patients. And that evidence generation requirement list can be matched against the opportunities we have to generate data as a result of MDR. And I think that's where we're going to find opportunities to optimize our investment.
Thank you, Arthi. I like this idea because I think that the MDR has introduced some underlying, not requirements, but underlying ways of doing. I think that the MDR is, allowing this holistic approach that you both have mentioned about multi-department, multi-functionalities working together. We were discussing now this mixture, right, between regulatory, market access. I think that this is something that it is underlying the MDR, this collaborative approach, right? And I think that having these two views has been very interesting to the conversation. Thanks a lot to both of you to providing this interesting feedback. Maybe just to close the discussion before we move to the Q&A, I would like just to ask you, like, if you need to tell the audience a 1 minute, 2 minute take home message from your side. I know it's difficult. I know there's a lot of requirements, but maybe just, a headline in terms of just one tip, that you may want to share with the audience. What would you say?
Thanks, Ainoa, for the question. I might actually share more than one as a take-home message, because as Arthi was speaking, I started to think about this as, it's human nature when something new comes along to compare it with what is in place currently. And I would say a message that came to my mind is, let's not try and compare MDR to MDD. It's very easy to look at the new set of regulations and say, under MDD, we were able to, if I had a device iteration, for example, I was able to just talk about what's new and compare it to the existing, versus now I'm being asked to create this whole new set of documentation. But as Arthi said, I think it's really important to see that silver lining and almost to her point, use it as an opportunity. What benefit that we as manufacturers can gain from this? And I think number one, and I'm repeating myself a little bit, partnership with the notified body. How can we make their life easier? And particularly for the regulatory folks on the line, this is where I think regulatory can be a game changer, or really that, I would say, a trusted partner to our cross-functional team, and set the right expectations that this is a team effort. It's not just a regulatory submission. And how can we come together internally as a team and have that unified front, and also bring the notified body along in the journey? How do we partner with them and make their life easier? If there are certain expectations that they have, or even if we're learning through the journey, then really taking it in our stride to say, this is going to benefit us for years to come. So what can we learn from this experience? So that would be, I would say, the top take-home message from my perspective. But there's a couple more. And, from a time and resource perspective, I think I said that at the beginning as well, is planning the time and resources is important, and planning a lot more than maybe what we originally anticipated, but also setting the right expectations internally, so there are no surprises down the road. So setting the expectation as to how long something like this can take, or what kind of risks there are, and how can we mitigate some of these. So making it all transparent then makes it a team effort, which is truly very, very important as we're going through this MDR journey. And then finally, I think from a technical documentation standpoint, a really practical take-home message is start on the GSPR checklist early. Because under the MDR, the expectation is that the technical documentation, or TD for short, should describe our approach to demonstrate compliance to each of the requirements requirements in each of the GSPRs. And that can take longer, perhaps, than anticipated. So making sure that there's enough time allocated for creation of the GSPR checklist, and also making sure that it is cross-functionally reviewed. So those, I know that was longer than a minute, I know.
No, but it was worth it. Thank you, Anaga. Arthi, do you want to share your view?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of key considerations from my point. I'm going to reiterate, work cross-functionally, educate your peers on the work that you're doing, but also the potential opportunities that brings to the table for your organization. When I say cross-functionally, I'm thinking about the marketing organization, I'm thinking about your health economics organization, I'm thinking about your market access organization, medical affairs. All of these colleagues operate on the availability of evidence. And so the work that you're doing now creates an opportunity for additional evidence coming into the company. Two, I would say familiarize yourself with the aspirational claims matrix. If you guys don't have an aspirational claims matrix, encourage this cross-functional team to really think about it and put some ideas on a piece of paper. Interrogate that document and ask whether it satisfies the needs of your regulatory stakeholders, your clinical stakeholders, and your payer stakeholders equally. And if it does, then you know what your evidentiary checklist needs to be. And then that will allow you to go back to what are the regulatory requirements for your portfolio, and really see where there may be opportunities to do more to help the business, to help your portfolio, and ultimately to help get these products into the patient's hands that you desire to. And so I would say the criticality of working cross-functionally and educating your peers on these opportunities is really the key take home.
So absolutely.
Thanks a lot. Thank you both. I think this has been very interesting and helpful tips for the audience to receive. And I am sure that a lot of the attendees today are probably struggling or have struggled or are dealing with implementation of MDR. So thanks again for these useful tips. We will now move to the Q&A. Let me check the Q&A box. The first question is if you will have the slides later that we presented, and the answer is yes. I mean, we can share the slides with no problem. The second question is, hi all, can I have a valid MDD certificate and parallel MDR certificate for the same medical device during the grace period, with two options? One, certificate from the same notified body. Two, certificates from two different notified bodies. Do you want to take it, Anaga, or do you want me to take it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide my perspective. That's certainly a very interesting way of looking at certification of devices. And again, just reiterating that each notified body is a little bit different. But in theory, if it's a medical device that is certified under, or I should say any thing certified under the MDD, the expectation would be to go through the MDCG guidance to determine if a change that is happening to the device would trigger transition to MDR, in which case then the expectation would be that the device would have to undergo an MDR application, review, and then a new certification. If it's the same exact device, so in other words, a term that we hear often is a legacy device, which is a device that is certified under the MDD that the manufacturer is looking to take to MDR, the certificate typically would have information about the device, such as the model number. And if that is changing, then a new certificate would have to be issued, which means that would indirectly trigger a transition to MDR. So I think it depends on what the manufacturer is looking to do. The expectation from the notified body is that if a device is certified under MDD, it can be used until expiration of the MDD certificate, and it can stay in the market as long as there aren't any significant changes being made to the device that would trigger a transition to MDR, which means a new certificate would have to be issued. So I hope that helps clarify it a little bit.
I think it does, Anaga. Thanks a lot. There are a couple of questions for Arthi. There are a couple of attendees asking about the aspirational claim matrix. I don't know if you can highlight a little bit more on that. And there are a couple of attendees that want to learn more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk about an aspirational claims matrix, a claims matrix is essentially a list of key messages that we need to be able to communicate to a variety of different stakeholders. Again, that might be regulators, it might be our clinical community, it could be patients, and certainly payers. And so you would have a list of what we would want to be able to say to these individuals and what type of evidence would be required to allow us to make that statement. A sophisticated matrix would have all of the stakeholders, the research we've done to understand what their needs are, who needs to be able to communicate that, because that will also establish the level of evidence required for one to be able to communicate that message. For example, if someone in the sales organization needs to be able to have that conversation, then that discussion needs to be on label. If it is something that the medical information team needs to be able to respond to upon customer solicitation, the level of evidence required to have that communication would be different. And so a claims matrix essentially summarizes the strategy, and an aspirational claims matrix is exactly that. It's what we hope to be able to say over the lifetime of our evidence generation journey. And so it's an opportunity, I think it's a great opportunity for multiple perspectives to be at one table to really pull that document together. And so that's what a claims matrix is. And if you have that, or if you have visibility to that, then as you build your post-market evidence generation strategy, you'll be able to take some of these requirements or aspirations into consideration in terms of your case report forms, or however you're going to be collecting data. You can include those into that process.
Thanks a lot, Arthi. There's another question. I think it's maybe more for Anaga. What is a good regulatory strategy for a rationale behind why a Pmcf is not applicable?
That might be one that is going to take a lot more time than what we can cover here. But at a high level, going back to what I was sharing earlier, this is why it is essential that a Pmcf plan is created in advance that the notified body has an opportunity to review and provide feedback on. Because really what they're looking for is they're looking for what we as a manufacturer are doing to proactively collect clinical data once the device is in the market. And if there's a certain rationale, and it again depends, the reason I say it's going to take a lot longer because it depends on the kind of device we're looking to certify. And if there is a strong rationale that we believe in for why a PMCF is not required, why perhaps the PMS data may be sufficient, or there are other means in which we can give the notified body the confidence that we're being responsible as a manufacturer for our devices that are placed on the market, that kind of rationale needs to be housed in the PMCF plan and presented to the notified body so they have an opportunity to challenge it. What that does is it avoids a potential query at a later time when the actual file is undergoing review. It also avoids surprises for the notified body and for the company. And I think if the approach to perhaps not having a PMCF makes sense for a certain kind of device, and it might, then that's where I think it's our opportunity to lay it out in a manner that makes sense to us and present it upfront. I would perhaps even recommend as early as when the application form is sent in.
I'd completely agree with you, Anaga. I think it's a very difficult question because there's a lot of different inputs, no, or information to be.
And types of devices too, it depends
Types
so
of
much
devices,
on.
yeah, exactly. And information, like it is directly related with the clinical data that you have, right? All the evidence that has been generated, if that clinical data is related with the risks, like which are the risks identified. Well, there's a lot to cover and to understand, no? If the PMCF proactive data collection is not needed. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and I think it also, what goes hand in hand maybe a little bit to this is the clinical evaluation plan. So I know the CER, of course, which is the heart of any kind of submission package, but also the clinical evaluation plan is another document that as a best practice under the MDR we would want to be prepared with upfront. And that also in a way details the manufacturer's approach to collection of clinical data. And that might also be one where we can expect that the notified body will have some level of feedback.
Thanks a lot. I think it's about time to start closing the discussion, even if it is interesting to continue. I mean, we could be talking about it for so long. There are so many topics to cover. I think we've left a couple of or 3 or 4 questions to reply, but for those questions that were asked with your name and surname, we will try to reply to you. Okay. Thanks a lot again, Arthi and Naga, for being here, for talking to the audience, and for sharing these good tips. And now I leave the floor to Nicole.
Thank you so much. What a great conversation. And I'm so glad that we were able to have this today. And thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to Alira Health for sponsoring this wonderful conversation. It's because of sponsors like this that we're able to bring this amazing educational opportunities to our membership. So please remember, we can't do this without you. We are going to have a follow-on conversation, so look forward to an invitation to that coming out in the next few weeks or months as we get those schedules coordinated. And I encourage you to visit massmedic.com to stay up to date on the latest events and join us as you can. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.